My name is June Whitfield. I'm 34 years old, and for the last 9 years I've made my living finding other people's missing money. I'm an internal auditor for a regional bank in Ohio, the kind of job where nobody invites you to parties because they assume you're already counting the silverware. My parents spent $65,000 on my sister's wedding. $22,140 of it came out of a trust that had my name on it too. My mother handed me a seating chart 3 days before the wedding and told me I wouldn't throw off the photos if I sat at the back table, near the kitchen doors. I thought that seating chart was the worst thing she'd do to me that week. I was wrong. 2 days later, an envelope arrived from my grandmother's estate attorney, addressed to me, containing a distribution notice I had never signed and never seen before that morning. But here's what none of them knew yet. I'd already found the original trust paperwork myself, 3 weeks earlier, sealed in a folder my grandmother left specifically for me, hidden behind nothing more suspicious than her old recipe box. By the time my sister's wedding reception reached the toasts, I was holding a microphone my mother had spent a decade making sure I'd never touch. Welcome back to the channel, where family secrets come apart at the seams and the quiet ones finally get heard. We tell stories about betrayal, money, and the moment someone stops absorbing it. If a story like this one lands close to home, drop a comment and subscribe. Back then, I still believed my mother's favoritism was just something I'd learned to live around, not something she'd been quietly converting into dollars. Growing up, my sister Marissa got the dance recitals and the school photos framed on the mantel. I got the report cards taped to the refrigerator, which my mother always called just as good, in a different way. Marissa is 29 now, 5 years younger than me, and she has our mother's face, the wide-set eyes, the easy smile that photographs well. I have our father's face, which nobody has ever built a personality around. I didn't grow up bitter about it, exactly. I grew up efficient about it. If I was going to be the practical daughter instead of the pretty one, I decided early to be very practical. I got a finance degree on a partial scholarship, moved 40 minutes from my parents' house in Maple Grove, and built a life that ran on schedules and reconciled statements. My father used to say I had a head for numbers, like your grandmother. He meant it as a compliment. My mother never said it at all. Our grandmother, Eleanor, died 2 years ago. She left behind a modest but real trust, proceeds from selling the family hardware store back in the 90s, invested conservatively, split 50-50 between me and Marissa, to be distributed in full when each of us turned 35. My father was named trustee. I was 28 months from my 35th birthday. Marissa had almost 7 years left on hers. I remember the reading of the will. My father cried, quietly, the way he cries at everything, sad movies, retirement speeches, the national anthem. My mother sat very straight and didn't cry at all. Afterward, in the parking lot, she said one thing to me that I filed away without understanding it yet. Well, she said, adjusting her sunglasses, at least now things can finally even out. I asked her what she meant. She said she didn't mean anything by it, that I was reading into things again. That was a phrase she used on me a lot, reading into things, usually right after she'd said something worth reading into. Marissa got engaged 8 months later, to a man named Grant who sells industrial HVAC equipment and calls my father sir without irony. The wedding planning started almost immediately, and it started large. A venue at a restored barn 45 minutes outside Columbus. A band instead of a DJ. A dress that Marissa described to me over the phone, breathless, as the one I actually cried in. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever watched someone plan the wedding you were quietly saving for your own life someday, and clapped along anyway because that's what a good sister does, you already know exactly what those months felt like for me. My mother called me in March, 11 months before the wedding, and asked whether I'd mind if some of the trust funds were used to help with costs. She framed it carefully. Just in advance, she said. Split evenly, obviously. Your grandmother would want the girls taken care of. I said that was fine. I want to be honest about that, because it matters later, I said yes. I trusted the word evenly. I trusted my father was the one actually managing it, because my father has never lied to me in his life, as far as I knew that spring. I didn't ask for documentation. That's the first thing I have to own here, before anyone else's dishonesty comes into it. I am a person who audits strangers' finances for a living, and I did not once ask to see a statement for my own family's trust. Some habits protect you at work and abandon you completely at home. The wedding date got closer, and the numbers I heard secondhand kept climbing. A florist bill that made Marissa's fiancé wince on a phone call I happened to overhear. A final venue balance my mother mentioned once at dinner, then immediately changed the subject from the way she did whenever a number got too specific. 6 weeks before the wedding, I drove to my parents' house to drop off a gift for the bridal shower and found my mother at the kitchen table with a folder of paperwork, the good kind of folder, the kind with a clasp. She closed it fast when I walked in, not guilty fast, just efficient fast, the way she does everything. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I filed it away the way I filed away the parking lot comment, the way I'd been filing things away about my mother for 3 decades, into a drawer marked later, maybe, probably nothing. That drawer was getting full. I just hadn't opened it yet. 4 weeks out, my mother started calling me the practical one in front of other people again, the way she does at every family event, usually paired with some version of "and Marissa's the pretty one," so it all balances out. She said it at the bridal shower in front of 11 women I'd never met, while pouring lemonade, in a tone so light it took me a beat to feel the sting land. Marissa laughed it off the way she always does, not cruelly, just automatically, the way you laugh at a family joke you've heard your whole life and stopped hearing as a joke or an insult, just as weather. I laughed too. I'm good at that. 3 weeks out, I got the seating chart. My mother texted me a photo of it with a note, "You're at table 9, near the kitchen, didn't want you stuck under the string lights, they wash out darker complexions in photos, you know how you get." I read that message 4 times standing in my own kitchen, and something in my chest did something I didn't have a word for yet. I called her. I asked, as evenly as I could manage, whether table placement was really about lighting. She said I was reading into things again. She said the caterer had actually suggested it. She said if I was going to be difficult about a seating chart 3 weeks before her only daughter's wedding. Her only daughter's wedding. I noticed that. I noticed it the way I notice a decimal point in the wrong column, small, easy to miss, impossible to unsee once you have. I let it go that night. I told myself it was a slip of the tongue, that she meant Marissa's wedding specifically, not that Marissa was somehow her only real daughter. I want to be honest that some part of me didn't fully believe my own explanation even as I was making it. 2 weeks out, I finally did the thing I should have done 11 months earlier. I logged into the online banking portal my father had set up for the trust years ago, back when he still thought I might co-manage it with him someday, back before he quietly stopped mentioning it. The password hadn't been changed since 2019. I typed it in almost as a joke, not expecting it to work. It worked. I didn't understand the numbers at first. I stared at them the way you stare at a sentence in a foreign language you technically studied once. Then I understood them perfectly, all at once, the way numbers eventually do resolve if you're the kind of person who spends her whole professional life waiting for them to. The trust had started at $211,000. My half should have sat, untouched, at just over $105,000. What the screen actually showed me was $62,411 remaining under my name. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I didn't cry. I want to tell you that clearly, because I know what you might be picturing. I didn't cry, and I didn't call my mother screaming, and I didn't do any of the things a person in a movie does in that moment. I opened a spreadsheet instead. It's what I know how to do with my hands when everything else in me has gone very still. I found the first withdrawal dated 14 months back, 6 weeks before Marissa even got engaged. $11,000, memo line, family advance. I stared at that date the longest, because it meant something I wasn't ready to say out loud yet, even to myself, sitting alone in my own kitchen with the lights off and my laptop the only thing glowing in the room. Somebody had started spending my half of that trust before there was even a wedding to spend it on. I didn't know it yet, but that $11,000 withdrawal wasn't the first lie in that account. It was the smallest one. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not yet. I want to be honest about why, because it isn't flattering. Some part of me needed to be certain before I let myself be angry, because being wrong about my own mother felt more dangerous than being right about her. I went back to work that Monday like nothing had happened. I sat through a compliance meeting about wire transfer thresholds and took notes I don't remember taking. My coworker Priya asked if I was feeling all right. I said I was fine. I'm good at that too, apparently, a family trait I didn't know I'd inherited until I needed it. That evening I called the trust's financial advisor, a soft-spoken man named Harold who'd handled my grandmother's accounts for 11 years and clearly assumed, correctly, that this call was routine. I asked for a full transaction history. He said he'd need my father's authorization since Robert was still listed as sole trustee. I said of course, no rush, and hung up before my voice could do anything I hadn't approved of first. My father called 2 days later. Not about the trust, about nothing, really, just checking in, the way he does every couple of weeks, usually while walking the dog and slightly out of breath. I asked him, as casually as I could manage, how the wedding planning was coming along on the money side. There was a pause. A real one, the kind that tells you more than the sentence that follows it. Your mother's handling most of that, he said. You know how she is with the details. I asked which details, specifically. He said something about the caterer, and then, almost as an afterthought, that Marissa had borrowed a little early against her half of Grandma's money, just to help things along, and that it would all balance out later. I asked him to define early. He said he'd have to check his files. He never called back with numbers. He called back 3 days later to ask if I could bring a folding table to the rehearsal dinner. If you've ever asked a direct question and watched someone hand you a folding table instead, you already know exactly how that conversation left me. I want to tell you about a Tuesday in April, because it's the day the shape of things started to change for me, even though nothing dramatic happened in it at all. I drove to my parents' house to pick up a serving platter my mother had borrowed years ago and never returned, which is the kind of errand entire families run on without noticing. My mother wasn't home. My father was in the garage, and he waved me toward the kitchen without getting up from whatever he was doing to the lawnmower. The good folder was on the counter. The one with the clasp. I didn't open it. I want that on the record, because it would have been so easy, and because not opening it cost me something I only understood weeks later. I told myself it wasn't mine to open, that whatever was in there was between my parents, that I was being paranoid the way my mother had spent 34 years telling me I was. I picked up the platter. I left. That night I lay awake doing the thing I do instead of sleeping when a number won't leave me alone. $11,000, 6 weeks before the engagement. I ran it forward and backward a dozen different ways, looking for an explanation that didn't require my mother to have started planning this before there was anything to plan. I found one, eventually, the kind of explanation you build because you need it more than you believe it. Maybe it wasn't about the wedding at all. Maybe there'd been some other family expense that year I didn't know about, my father's knee surgery, a roof repair, something ordinary and forgivable. I fell asleep almost convinced. I woke up and looked up the surgery date. It was 9 months after the withdrawal. 2 weeks before the wedding, Marissa called me, genuinely excited, to talk through the seating arrangement for the head table, a completely different chart than the one I'd already gotten, one where I was, in fact, seated near the front, 3 seats down from her. Mom said you were being weird about tables, Marissa said, half laughing. I fixed it. You're up front. Obviously. I sat with that a long time after we hung up. Because it told me something I hadn't wanted to consider yet, that my mother had made a decision about where I sat, presented it to me as the caterer's idea, and then let Marissa quietly override it without ever mentioning that she had. Which meant either my mother had lied about the caterer, or my mother had lied about the reason, or both. It also meant Marissa didn't know. Whatever this was, my sister wasn't in on it. That mattered to me more than I expected it to. For a while, honestly, I let myself suspect Marissa anyway. Not the seating, the money. She was the one getting married. She was the one with the growing bills, the one who'd have motive, the one whose fiancé worked in sales and talked, more than once at family dinners, about wanting to get ahead of things financially before the wedding. I watched her more closely than I'm proud of, that April and May. I noticed a new car in her driveway, a lease, it turned out, nothing connected to any of this, but I noticed it, and for 2 days I let it mean something it didn't. I know some of you already see exactly where this is heading. I didn't, not yet, and not for the reason you'd think. What actually broke the theory apart was smaller than I expected. Marissa mentioned, offhand, over coffee, that she'd asked our mother directly about the trust money going toward the wedding, months earlier, and that our mother had told her plainly, apparently, that it was already worked out. Don't worry about the details, that's between me and your father. Marissa had never seen a number. She'd never asked to. She trusted the woman who raised her the way I once had, and there was nothing dishonest in that, only the same inheritance I'd spent 34 years absorbing without a name for it. She wasn't hiding anything. She was exactly as in the dark as I'd been 11 months earlier, when I'd said yes to an advance, split evenly. The only difference between us was that I'd finally logged into an account she didn't know existed. I felt something cold and clarifying settle into place. Not relief, exactly. More like a door closing on one hallway so that only one hallway was left to walk down. My mother started calling more that month, small check-ins that weren't really check-ins. Did I have my dress for the rehearsal? Had I RSVP'd for the shower gift registry? Was I doing all right? A question she asked in a tone that suggested she already had an answer and was waiting for me to confirm it. I noticed, without meaning to, that she never once asked how work was going. She used to, in the years before Grandma died. She'd stopped somewhere in the last 14 months, without either of us marking the moment it happened. I called Harold again, this time with my father's verbal authorization, secured through a conversation where I simply told my father I wanted a copy of the trust statements for my own records, which was true, and which he agreed to without asking a single follow-up question. That, too, told me something. A man managing his mother's estate for 2 daughters doesn't usually agree that fast to a request like that unless some part of him already knows what the paperwork will say, and some larger part of him doesn't want to be the one who has to explain it. Harold's assistant emailed the documents 9 days later, 9 days that felt considerably longer than 9 days, filled with ordinary things I did on autopilot, a bridal shower where I smiled through 3 separate photos, a dress fitting where the seamstress complimented how composed I seemed, which struck me as an odd thing to compliment in a person picking out an outfit for her sister's wedding. The email arrived on a Thursday evening while I was standing at my own kitchen counter eating cereal for dinner, the way I do on nights I don't want to think too hard about anything, which is exactly the kind of night that ends up mattering. 14 months of statements. 6 figures at the start. I told myself I already knew roughly what I'd find, and I still wasn't ready for the actual shape of it once it was laid out in black and white, 11 separate withdrawals, not one, each memo-lined in language soft enough to survive a glance and specific enough, once you added them up, to tell an entire story nobody had bothered narrating to me directly. 11,000. Then 4,200. Then a gap of months, and then 3 withdrawals in a single 6-week stretch that made my stomach do something I felt in my actual body, not just in the part of me that reads numbers for a living. I didn't know it yet, but the biggest withdrawal on that statement, the one dated exactly 19 days before the wedding, hadn't even happened yet when I finally opened that email. It was still coming. I printed the statements. I don't fully know why, some old instinct from work, the belief that paper makes a thing real in a way a screen doesn't. I sat at my kitchen table with a highlighter and did what I do every day for strangers, except this time the account belonged to me, And the person moving money out of it had once cut my sandwiches into triangles because I refused to eat them cut into squares. 11 withdrawals. $89,589 total, drawn entirely against my half. Marissa's half sat untouched, exactly where Grandma Eleanor had left it, growing quietly at just over $105,000. I called Priya from work that Saturday, not to explain everything. I wasn't ready for that, but because I needed to hear a normal human voice ask me something that wasn't about seating charts. She asked if I wanted to get coffee. I said maybe next week. She didn't push. That's the kind of friend Priya is, and I noticed, sitting there after we hung up, that I couldn't think of a single person in my own family who'd have let a maybe next week just sit there without turning it into a diagnosis. The wedding was 10 days out. My mother texted a group chain, me, my father, Marissa, and Grant, with a spreadsheet of final vendor payments due that week, coded in a soft yellow highlight that made everything look tidy and agreed upon. I opened it on my phone in the bank parking lot before my shift and felt my hands go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. There it was. A line item labeled Trust, Final Draw, dated 4 days out, for $22,411. Nobody in that group chain but me would have recognized that as anything other than administrative language. To me it read like a confession typed in the wrong font. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever watched your own family plan something in front of you, using language specifically built so you'd never have reason to ask a follow-up question, you already know exactly what that parking lot felt like. I didn't respond in the group chain. I called my father instead, that evening, and asked him plainly, not carefully anymore, not softened, whether he understood that the money coming out of the trust for this wedding was coming exclusively from my half. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had the particular flatness of a man reciting something he'd rehearsed without quite believing it. Your mother said you two had discussed it. That you were fine splitting it this way because Marissa needed it more right now, and you'd catch up later when you hit 35 anyway. I asked him when, exactly, I'd discussed that with my mother. He said he didn't know the specifics. He said your mother handles the details. He said it the way he'd said it about the wedding, about the caterer, about everything for 34 years, and for the first time in my life I heard what that sentence actually was. Not deference. Absence. I asked him one more question before I hung up. I asked if he'd signed off on each withdrawal himself as trustee, or if he'd just let it happen. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I got my answer before he gave it to me in words. I didn't sleep much that week. I moved through my days documenting things the way I document a suspicious account at work, dates, amounts, screenshots, timestamps, except the account belonged to my own childhood, and the fraud, if that's even the right word for something your own mother does to you, was dressed up the whole time as love. 6 days out, I drove to Maple Grove for the rehearsal dinner setup, mostly folding chairs and unrolling table runners in a rented barn that smelled like fresh sawdust and somebody's grandmother's roses. My mother was in her element there, directing florists, correcting a groomsman's tie, glowing in the specific way she only glows when she's the center of gravity in a room. I watched her a long time from across the barn, holding a folding chair, and understood something that landed harder than any spreadsheet had. She wasn't a woman secretly stealing from her daughter. In her mind, I don't think she was stealing anything at all. She was evening things out, the way she'd said in that parking lot 2 years ago, paying down some ledger she'd been keeping her whole life, one where Marissa's face and my report cards had never quite balanced against each other, and where I'd apparently been quietly assigned the role of the daughter who could absorb the difference. That didn't make it forgivable. But it made it make sense, and somehow that was worse. For days out, the day of the final draw, the 22,000, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A woman named Carol, from the barn venue's accounting office, asking to confirm wire details for the balance due, referencing an account number that wasn't the trust's operating account at all. It was a personal account. My father's. I asked her, carefully, whether she could confirm the source institution. She read it back to me without hesitation, the way people do when they have no idea the number they're reciting is about to matter. It matched a linked account on the trust statements one Herald's paperwork had flagged, in a single line I'd almost skimmed past, as a secondary distribution channel my father had set up 11 months earlier. The exact same month as that first $11,000 withdrawal. I want to be honest about what I did next, because it's the moment I'm least proud of in this whole story. I could have called my father right then and confronted him with what Carol had just told me. Instead, I thanked her, hung up, and drove straight to the bank, my bank, the one I work at, and pulled every certified document Harold's office would release to me as a named beneficiary. I told myself I was building a case. Some part of me knows now I was also stalling, giving myself 2 more days of not having to say the thing out loud to anyone in my family, because once I said it, there'd be no version of that wedding where I got to just be a guest again. I found the account behind the account that night, alone at my kitchen table, and I did something I'd never let myself do in 14 months of finding pieces of this. I let myself cry. Not for the money. For a version of my mother I'd apparently invented a long time ago and had been quietly protecting, the way you protect a person, not a fact. 2 days out, my mother called to remind me about hair appointments. I asked her, evenly, whether she'd like to tell me what a secondary distribution channel was. There was a pause exactly like my father's had been, except my mother's recovered faster. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. Where is this coming from, June? 2 days before your sister's wedding? She thought that sentence would end it. It didn't hold for even 1 more day. I didn't push further that call. I said I had to go. I sat with the folder Harold had sent, the real one, thick now, tabbed, the kind of file I build for strangers all the time and had never once imagined building against my own family, and I made the decision that would carry me through the next 48 hours. I wasn't going to confront my mother privately, in a kitchen, where she could reframe it into me being difficult 2 days before Marissa's wedding, the way she'd reframed a seating chart, a caterer's opinion, an entire 14 months. I was going to bring the truth to the one place she'd spent a decade building specifically to be watched. The rehearsal dinner toasts. The reception. A microphone she'd have to hand someone eventually, because it was tradition, because the maid of honor's sister always says a few words, because nobody, not even my mother, could rewrite that particular seating chart at the last minute without everyone noticing. I didn't know it yet, standing in my kitchen with that folder closed under my hand, that my mother had already decided something too, something about what she was going to say if I ever did open my mouth in front of that many people, a story she'd apparently been rehearsing longer than I'd been building mine. I woke up on the wedding day at 5 in the morning, before my alarm, before the birds, before anything in Maple Grove had decided to be awake yet. I lay in the dark and thought about my grandmother's recipe box, the one that had sat on a shelf in her kitchen my whole childhood, the one nobody had thought to look behind until she'd left it to me specifically, in writing, as if she'd known even then that I'd be the one who needed a paper trail more than I'd need a casserole recipe. I'd read the folder she'd left me a dozen times by then. It wasn't dramatic, no smoking gun, no confession letter. Just the original trust documents, her handwritten notes in the margins, and one line, in her small, careful cursive, underlined twice, split evenly means evenly. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, especially the people who taught you to be quiet. I didn't know, when I first found that folder 3 weeks before the wedding, how directly she'd been talking to me. I understood it completely now. If you've ever found out that the one person in your family who really saw you had been trying to protect you from something before you even knew there was anything to protect against, you already know what that morning felt like. I got dressed slowly. Sage green, knee-length, the dress my mother had approved without comment, which from her was as close to praise as I usually got. I put the folder, the real one, Harold's folder, thick and tabbed, into a tote bag I left in my car. Not to bring inside. Just to know it was there, the way you check twice that you've locked the front door before a long drive. The ceremony was lovely, in the specific way weddings are lovely when you're not the bride, when your own name has quietly become a subplot in someone else's day. Marissa looked exactly the way she described crying over the dress, the light through the barn's high windows, Grant's face doing something unguarded and real when she came down the aisle. I felt something soften in me watching that, something that had nothing to do with trusts or withdrawals. Whatever my mother had done, Marissa hadn't done any of it. She deserved every bit of that light, and for the length of the vows, I let myself just be a sister. I sat at table 3 near the front, exactly where Marissa had moved me. My mother caught my eye across the room during the recessional and gave me a small, satisfied nod, the kind that says, "See, I fixed it, we're fine now," as if a better seat could retroactively explain 14 months of withdrawals, as if proximity to the head table was a kind of restitution. I nodded back. I didn't smile. I don't think she noticed the difference, or maybe she noticed and decided not to read into it, which would have been fitting, given how many times she'd told me not to read into things myself. Dinner passed in the ordinary blur of past plates and a band tuning up in the corner. I ate almost nothing. I kept thinking about Harold's folder in my car, sitting in the heat, and about a specific sentence my grandmother had written that I hadn't fully understood until that morning, especially the people who taught you to be quiet. My mother hadn't taught me to be quiet by yelling at me to be quiet. She'd taught me by rewarding the silence every single time I offered it, a compliment when I didn't push back, a small warmth when I let a comment about my complexion or my seat or my practicality pass without comment. 34 years of positive reinforcement for absorbing things. I understood, sitting at that table, that tonight was the first time in my adult life I was choosing not to take the reward. The toast started a little after 8. Grant's best man went first, a rambling, good-natured speech about their college fraternity that got real laughs and one groan from Grant's mother. Then the maid of honor, Marissa's college roommate, cried through a toast that was mostly inside jokes I didn't understand, which was fine, because it wasn't for me. Then my mother stood up. I want to be honest that I hadn't expected this part. Tradition in our family had always been the maid of honor and best man only. But my mother rose from her seat at the head table with the particular unhurried confidence of a woman who had never once needed anyone's permission to speak in a room she considered hers, and the band leader, without being asked, handed her the microphone like it had been arranged in advance. Maybe it had. "I just want to say a few words," she began, and the room quieted the way rooms do for mothers of brides, "about my girls." My girls. Plural. I noted it, the way I note everything, and waited. She talked about Marissa first, the dance recitals, the wedding dress she'd cried in, the wide-set eyes she'd inherited from the Whitfield side, which wasn't even true, those eyes came from my mother's own mother, but nobody in that room was going to correct her. Then, almost as an afterthought, the kind of afterthought she'd perfected over 3 decades, she turned partway toward my table. "And June," she said, "my practical one. The one who keeps us all honest with numbers." A small laugh moved through the room, warm, unknowing. I don't know what we'd do without her keeping track of things. I felt that land the way you feel a paper cut, small, precise, and somehow worse for how little force it took. Keeping us all honest with numbers. She said it like an inside joke about my job. I heard it as something else entirely, and for one long second I wondered if it was possible she knew exactly what she was saying, dressing the truth up as a compliment the way she'd dressed up every withdrawal as an advance. She finished with something about family always finding its way back to balance, raised her glass, and the room applauded, and she started to hand the microphone back toward the band. That's when Marissa, glowing, a little flushed from champagne, called out from the head table, "Wait, June, you should say something too. You're the only one who hasn't." I watched my mother's face do something very small and very fast, not panic, exactly, my mother doesn't panic, but a recalibration. The kind of split-second recalculation I recognized because I do the same thing every day at work when a number comes in that doesn't match the ledger. She recovered in under a second. "Oh, June doesn't like to be the center of attention," she said, already moving to sit, already treating the moment as closed. "I don't mind," I said. I hadn't planned to say it out loud like that, in front of 140 people, but it came out steady, and it was the first true thing I'd said in that barn all day. The microphone came toward me across the room, passed hand to hand, and I felt every second of that walk toward the front like something being decided in real time, even though I'd decided it 3 weeks earlier, alone in my kitchen, with a folder closed under my hand. I stood up. I smoothed my sage green dress. I looked at my mother, who was smiling the fixed, bright smile she wore for photographs, and I thought about the recurring line she'd used on me my whole life, the one she'd texted me 3 weeks ago about table 9 near the kitchen doors. Don't throw off the photos. I took the microphone. Thank you, I said, and the room settled the way rooms do when they sense something is about to be different from what they expected. I actually do have something I want to say. About family. About numbers. I think you'll find I'm good at both. I didn't look at the tote bag still sitting in my car. I didn't need to. I'd read those statements enough times that I could have recited the dates in my sleep, and for the first time in 14 months, I wasn't planning to keep them to myself. I've given a lot of toasts in my life, none of them like this. But I've spent 9 years reading balance sheets for a living, so I know how to tell a story with numbers when I have to. When I was 7, I said, my mother told me I was the practical one and Marissa was the pretty one, and she said it like it was a gift she was giving both of us. I believed her for a long time. I want to thank her for that, actually, because being practical is exactly what let me notice something over the last few months that I think everyone in this room deserves to hear, especially the bride. I felt the room shift. Not gasping, not yet, just the particular stillness of 140 people realizing a wedding toast had turned into something else, and nobody quite sure yet whether to be entertained or alarmed. My mother's smile hadn't moved, but her eyes had. I'd seen that exact look on embezzlers twice my age, sitting across a conference table from me at the bank, in the half-second before they decided whether to bluff or fold. Grandma Eleanor left Marissa and me a trust, I said, split 50-50. Some of you knew that. What most of you don't know is that over the last 14 months, $89,589 came out of my half to help pay for tonight. Not split evenly. Not both halves. Mine. Somewhere near the back, I heard Grant's mother make a small sound. Marissa's face had gone very still, the champagne flush draining out of it in real time, and I felt something twist in my chest, because none of this was about her, and I needed her to know that before I said one more word. Marissa, I said, turning to her, you didn't do this. I want to be really clear about that. You asked Mom directly if the money was fair, and she told you it was handled. She lied to both of us. Just in different directions. My mother stood up so fast her chair scraped audibly against the barn's wood floor. June. Her voice had the bright, brittle edge she used when she was managing a room, not talking to a person. This is not the time. It's the only time you ever gave me, I said, and I said it gently, which I think surprised her more than anger would have. You had 11 months to have this conversation with me in private. You had a folder on your kitchen counter in April you didn't want me to see. You had a phone call 4 days ago where you told me you didn't know what a secondary distribution channel was, and then Dad's name showed up on a wire confirmation for the venue balance the very next morning. You're humiliating your sister, my mother said, her voice climbing, on her wedding day, over money that was always going to even out. That's the thing, I said. It was never going to even out. Grandma left instructions. I have them in the car. She wrote that split evenly means evenly, in her own handwriting, and she left it for me specifically, like she knew someone might try to tell me otherwise. I watched something happen on my mother's face then that I'd never seen in 34 years, not anger, not quite grief, something closer to being caught mid-sentence in a story she'd been telling herself so long she'd started believing it. I was going to pay it back, she said, quieter now, mostly to me, though the microphone carried it to every table. Before June turns 35. I was always going to make it right before the distribution. With what money, Mom? I asked. Not cruel. Just the question a person asks when they actually want an answer. She didn't have one. Robert didn't have one either. He sat frozen at the head table, his face the color of the tablecloth, and I understood, watching him, that whatever he'd told himself these past 14 months, "I'm just the trustee, your mother handles the details," had just collapsed in front of 140 witnesses, and some part of him looked almost relieved that it had. "I'm not doing this to ruin the wedding," I said, and I meant it, and I looked at Marissa when I said it. "The wedding already happened. You're married. That part's yours, and it's good, and nobody can take it back. I'm doing this because I found out 3 weeks before this wedding that I was never going to be told the truth unless I stood somewhere Mom couldn't control the room. This was the only room like that left." My mother sat back down slowly, the way you sit down when your legs have made the decision before you have. She didn't say anything else into a microphone that had already stopped being useful to her. I handed the microphone back to the band, thanked everyone for listening, and said the only warm thing I had left in me that night, which was true anyway: "Congratulations, Marissa and Grant. I love you both. I'm sorry it happened tonight instead of some quiet Tuesday, but there wasn't going to be a quiet Tuesday. There was never going to be one." I sat down. The room did the thing rooms do after something like that, a long beat of silence, then the band, mercifully, starting a song, giving everyone somewhere to look that wasn't each other. Marissa found me 20 minutes later, in the little hallway by the coat check, still in her dress, mascara gone slightly soft at the corners of her eyes. I braced for her to be angry at me. She wasn't. "Is it true?" she asked. "All of it?" "I have the statements in my car," I said. "You can see every page whenever you want." She was quiet a long moment. "I asked her," she said. "In March. I actually asked her if it was fair to you." "I know," I said. "She told me you didn't need to worry about the details." Marissa laughed, one short, humorless sound. "She said the same thing to me about you." She looked at me, and something passed between us that hadn't been there in years, not since we were kids sharing a room, before the recitals and the report cards had quietly sorted us into different categories. "I don't want this money if it came from you," she said. "I mean that. Grant and I will figure out the venue balance ourselves if we have to." "You don't have to decide that tonight," I said. "No," she said. "But I'm deciding it anyway." My father found me last, near the parking lot, still in his rented tux jacket, looking older than he had that morning. He didn't defend himself. He didn't ask me to understand him. He just said, "I should have looked at the statements myself. I let your mother handle it because it was easier than asking her hard questions. That's on me, not just her. It wasn't everything. It wasn't an apology big enough to undo 14 months. But it was the first fully honest sentence he'd said to me since this whole thing started, and after everything, I found I could take that much from him." I drove home that night with the folder still in the passenger seat, past the barn's string lights fading in my rearview mirror, and I didn't feel triumphant the way I thought I might. I felt something quieter, like a long column of numbers that had finally, after 14 months, been made to add up to something true. The weeks after the wedding didn't unfold like a story. There was no single scene where everything resolved, just a slow accumulation of smaller, quieter moments, the kind that don't make for a dramatic toast but end up mattering more in the long run. Harold's office froze any further activity on the trust within days. Once my father formally requested it, the first fully proactive thing he'd done in this entire ordeal. A mediator got involved, at my suggestion, mostly because I didn't trust myself to negotiate fairly with my own mother, and I didn't think she trusted herself either, though she'd never have said so out loud. It took until August to reach an agreement. The trust would be restructured so that my remaining balance was protected outright, distributed to me early and in full, while Marissa and Grant took on a modest loan against the venue balance instead of touching money that had never really been theirs to spend. My father stepped down as sole trustee. Harold's firm took over administration directly. My mother didn't attend the mediation. She sent my father in her place, which told me something about where she'd landed emotionally that no conversation could have. I didn't speak to her for 6 weeks. Not out of spite, I want to be honest about that, but because I genuinely didn't know what to say to a woman I'd spent 34 years trying to be practical enough to earn. It turned out I'd never needed to earn anything. I just hadn't known that yet. She called in late July, finally, on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner alone in my apartment, and I almost didn't pick up. I did, eventually. "I've been seeing someone," she said, without preamble. "A counselor. Your father suggested it. I didn't think I needed it." A pause. "I think I needed it." I didn't say anything right away. I let the silence sit there, the way she'd let so many of mine sit unanswered over the years. "My mother did this to me," she said finally, quieter than I'd ever heard her. "Not money. But she had a favorite. My sister Paulette. I was the one who got told I was smart instead of pretty, my whole childhood, like it was supposed to be a consolation prize." She stopped. "I told myself I'd never do that to you girls. I don't think I understood I'd already done it until I heard myself say my practical one into a microphone in front of 140 people. I want to be honest that I didn't fully forgive her in that phone call. I'm not sure I've fully forgiven her even now, months later, and I don't think that's required of me. But I understood her, in a way I hadn't let myself before, not as an excuse, but as a shape. A woman who'd spent her whole childhood being the practical one too, and who'd built her entire adult life around making sure that role never landed on the daughter she actually favored, without ever noticing she'd simply handed it to the other one instead. "I'm not asking you to fix this today," she said. "I know I can't. I just wanted you to know I finally looked at it. All of it. Not just the money. We talk now, occasionally. Sunday phone calls, careful and a little formal, the way you talk to someone you're rebuilding trust with one deposit at a time. She hasn't called me the practical one since the wedding. I don't think she will again, not because she's forbidden herself from it, but because I think she finally understands what that phrase cost, every single time she used it as a consolation prize instead of what it actually was, a smaller portion of love, dressed up to look fair. Marissa and I are closer than we've been since we were kids. She and Grant paid off their portion of the venue loan themselves, faster than anyone expected, and she still brings it up sometimes, not with guilt, exactly, but with a kind of clear-eyed gratitude that I think will outlast the wedding itself. "I got the marriage," she told me once, over coffee. "You got the truth. I think you got the better deal, honestly, even if it took longer to cash in." My father and I talk more than we used to, too, smaller conversations, but more honest ones. He asked me last month, hesitantly, if I'd consider co-managing what's left of the estate planning with Harold's firm, formally this time, my name on the paperwork instead of buried behind his. I said yes. Not because I need to prove anything to him, but because I'm good at this, and for the first time in my life, being good at this feels like something that belongs to me, rather than something I was assigned because nobody thought to give me anything else. I turned 35 in September. The distribution came through clean, documented, exactly what my grandmother intended it to be from the beginning. I used part of it to put a down payment on a small house 40 minutes from Maple Grove, closer, actually, than my old apartment, which surprised some people. I didn't move closer to keep the peace. I moved closer because I finally trust that if something's wrong, I'll look at it directly instead of filing it away in a drawer marked later, maybe, probably nothing. I kept my grandmother's recipe box. I keep the folder in it now, behind the recipes, the way she kept the trust documents behind hers. I don't know if I'll ever need it again. But I like knowing it's there, the same way she must have liked knowing hers was there, for 28 years, waiting for the exact granddaughter who'd know to look behind the recipes instead of just accepting the seat she was handed. If you've ever been the practical one in a family that quietly decided love came in 2 sizes, I hope this story told you something you needed to hear. Being the one who keeps the numbers honest isn't a consolation prize. Sometimes it's the only reason the truth ever gets told at all. If this story meant something to you, let me know in the comments. And if you're the one in your family who's always been asked not to throw off the photos, I'd love to hear your story too. The hardest number in this story was never $65,000. It was $89,589, the amount that came out of one daughter's future so the other daughter's day could look effortless. Money is rarely just money in families like this one. It's a ledger of who gets protected and who gets asked to absorb the difference quietly. What made Diane's betrayal so hard to simply condemn was that it wasn't born from cruelty, it came from an old, unhealed inheritance of her own. She spent her childhood as the smart daughter standing next to a favored sister, and instead of breaking that pattern, she recreated it with different labels, practical and pretty. She likely told herself, for months, that she was simply righting an old imbalance rather than manufacturing a new one. That doesn't excuse the 11 withdrawals. But it explains why she never saw them as theft, only as correction. June's real undoing wasn't the money either. It was the years spent filing away small, specific signals, a closed folder, a seating chart, a slip of the tongue calling Marissa an only daughter, into a drawer marked probably nothing. Families train some of their members to stop asking questions by rewarding the silence every time. June's silence wasn't weakness. It was a skill she'd been taught since childhood, and it took a locked account balance to finally break it. The wedding toast didn't fix anything on its own. It simply forced a conversation that 11 months of politeness had been built specifically to avoid. Real accountability came later, in mediation rooms and Sunday phone calls, slower and far less satisfying than any single speech could be. Maybe the real question isn't whether Diane loved her daughters unevenly on purpose. Maybe it's how many of us are quietly filling the same role in our own families, the practical one, the reasonable one, the one who's expected not to throw off the photos, and telling ourselves it doesn't cost anything to keep smiling for the picture.